Moving on, it's my pleasure to invite Patty Spears from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who will be reviewing how to include patient advocates in clinical research.
Thank you. It's great to be back to San Antonio and great to be here in person today. And thank you for the invitation to speak about my favorite topic of involving patient advocates in your clinical research and in your research in general. I think we've heard some good talks so far, so I'm really excited. Here's my disclosure. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through, since this is a workshop, of who are patient advocates, why should you even involve patient advocates, what can patient advocates actually do for you, and when should this happen, and then how should this happen? I think we say involve patient advocates but don't give you any tools, so I'm going to try to give you a few tools, and then I'm going to do an example of patient engagement that I'm involved in the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology, a real-life example. So I just want to start off, too, by saying patient advocates include many different patients. You can be a survivor of the cancer, you can be someone living with the cancer, you can be a caregiver of someone with the cancer, or even just somebody who's been affected by somebody affected by that cancer and be a really good patient advocate. The difference is that we are research patient advocates, so I'll kind of explain what that means. And you might know about different types of advocacy. Before you think of research advocacy, you might think of fundraising, support, policy, and political advocates, and we kind of belong to this special class called research advocates. And who we are, there's a lot of different types of patients you can involve in your research as a research patient advocate, be patients, patient groups, or research patient advocates. So I'll go over what those differences are. So a lot of times you just need the experience of the patient. You just need to know, well, what was it like to have that chemotherapy? What kind of, side effects did you have? Just that personal experience. And you can go to just individual patients for that. And I've done that for several groups as well. Patient groups are really easy to find in breast cancer. We have many that really concentrate on a specific cancer or a specific topic, and they're easily accessible, and they have constituents of a lot of different patients. And so if you really want to get a survey out to a lot of patients, those are groups that you can go to, and they're really easy to find, and that's why a lot of people, I think, go to patient groups. But research patient advocates, we're kind of like a different hybrid group where we have the individual experience that we can bring to the table. We also communicate with a lot of other patients and a lot of other patient advocates. We belong to multiple different patient groups. But the difference is we really want to learn more about the research, and as we, become more involved in research, we get more knowledgeable in the research, and we really want to learn about that. And so we have this vested interest in research as well. Not all of us have a research background, just an interest in research. And so the NCI actually came up with the definition of research advocate in 2011, someone who brings a non-scientific viewpoint to the research process and communicates a collective viewpoint. So it's really the collective perspective, broad impact, and an interest in science. And why should you involve a patient advocate? So you know who we are, so why should you do this? And it's about perception and perspective. Right, so you can have different stakeholders bring a different perspective to the table, whether it's pharmaceutical industry versus the government funded in the clinical trial realm, for example, individual versus population. And I'll give you an example of the patient versus doctor, which will bring this home to you. I always like to use examples, so you have the patient and doctor perspective. So you go in and you try to make a treatment decision. The doctor is thinking about their experience with other patients, the evidence of what they just read and learned at SABCS. They think about the benefit of the treatment to the patient and what the risk or harms might be. The patient, on the other hand, we come into the room with a different little perspective. We just really want to keep on living. A cancer diagnosis is life-altering. Some of us are in pain. We just want to be out of pain. We want to live a normal life and have normal activity. And most of all, we want a cure. And so it's really about not thinking the same as each other, but understanding each other so that we can really communicate and make that best decision. And here's another graphic from, I know Deb Collier uses this a lot, but perception really does matter. And there's been articles about this where oncologists might focus more on survival, whereas patients might actually value quality of life a little bit more depending on their situations. So we look at the same thing a little differently, and we see it in different ways, just like the parents and the baby might see it mobile. And then also, I think it's important to involve patient advocates because communicating your science to the public is becoming essential these days. And I think we've learned a lot from COVID that you really have to get out there and be able to speak in plain language to everyone and explain things really well. And this was an article that I pulled up back in 2013. I've been using this article in classes about why you should speak about your science to the public so that politicians will listen. So if you don't do that, then politicians will listen only to ideological arguments free of data, and we definitely don't want that. So what can patient advocates do? Well, I'll speak more on clinical, but we're involved in all different aspects of research, from basic translational, clinical, epidemiology, population studies, and drug approval. So here's some more detailed information on, putting some effort into patient engagement in two different areas, in clinical trial development and clinical research, as well as in laboratory research. I think we forget about that a lot, but I think it's really important to involve advocates in laboratory research as well. So I'll go over the two major areas, the laboratory and clinical, and then I'll go over it in the different, every project has a beginning, middle, and end. So it's concept, conduct, and completion. So I'll go over that for laboratory and then clinical. So in laboratory research, I think patients can bring to the table thinking translationally first. It's never too early to think about how your research might affect patients in the end. We're collaborative, we break down silos. We know what benefits patients, and sometimes it brings urgency to the table as well. Seeing a patient's face can bring urgency to your research. So at conception, is your question important to patients? I mean, that's one of the first things. When you write your applications, we can always look at your lay abstract and help you really convey that impact to patients in a way that everybody's going to understand, and it's going to make a difference, and really become a member of your team when it begins. During the conduct, we look ahead to translation. We can attend lab meetings and be really comfortable with what your research is so we can make a better impact. During completion, like I said, communicating is really important, so we can really facilitate that communication with the public, whether it's joint presentations, or I do a lot of blogging, plain language summaries we'll talk about, and having a patient voice on that is really, really important. And then in clinical research, there's a lot that we do in clinical research, and it's really important to get us in there very early and often, because once a trial is out and running, it's very hard to fix it. But if we're at the table at the beginning and we can notice some big barriers to patient accrual or acceptance of the study or importance of the study, meaningfulness, it's better to have that up front. The burden to the patient, we know as patients what it takes to get treatment. We know what's important to us, and what's going to really help patients stay on the study. I think we heard some talks this morning about, patients staying on study and staying on the drugs, and, that's really important, to get the drug actually in the patient for it to actually help the patient, and really identify those barriers. So in clinical trials and clinical research, these are some things at beginning, middle, and end. There's more on there, but I'll just highlight the checked boxes. But really identifying those endpoints that are really meaningful to patients is really important up front of any clinical trial. Review the patient-reported outcome assessments that are going to be used, and review the protocol and consent forms, things like that before it even opens is important so that you can mitigate some of that. During the conduct, really just keeping an eye on patient burden and coming up with, ways to get around it if there are some issues that come up. There always are. It seems help develop patient educational materials. Sometimes you need informational materials and sometimes you need education materials. And the consent form is not the place to educate, so you really need those extra materials. and help identify those accrual barriers. And then completion, again, the importance of the study results summary that can actually get to the public or the patient to kind of build that trust in science that we're going to hear about later. And we can really help you do that and really facilitate that communication. And I think in clinical research, it's really important because you've really taken like the samples from patients and, how have you used those samples and gotten to answers? And I think that's what patients really want to know. And in the whole drug development process, not just in the clinical trial itself, but in the entire process, from discovery at the bench through to the outcomes and through to the FDA approvals, all along there, patients and patient advocates can be really helpful to help you, really identify that important question. I can't tell you how important that is to get it right up front before you go down that path. And really, one of the things I have on here that I haven't talked about yet is really the eligibility criteria. I think a lot of times us as patients look very critical at that because many of us have tried to participate in clinical trials and have not been able to because of an eligibility criteria that kept us out of the study. So I always look at the eligibility criteria not by who's in the study, but who's not in the study. And in breast cancer, if there's not a scientific reason, please just open it up to females and males. Don't leave men out of our studies because even though you might not get a lot of males on the study, you will open that opportunity up to a male breast cancer patient to participate in a clinical trial and possibly get access to a drug that they don't have access to otherwise. So please consider that. But that's one of the things that we look at in the drug development process. So when do you engage patient advocates? Early and often. It differs in different projects. And so I kind of made these timelines of different ways. So when you're applying for a grant, start at the RFP. When you get the RFP, if there's patients involved, contact and get a patient advocate. And then stay in communication with them through the submission and notification of award. Even if you don't get it, let your patient advocate know. During clinical trial development, early and often, even more often, I think, because it's so critical. But really, when the idea is submitted, I think you should engage your patient advocate at that time and all the way through to the end of the study. And I'll give you an example of that and how we do that at the Alliance for Clinical Trials. And so this has been a big conundrum, and I thought long and hard about this, and I've got some of these statements from different articles that have been written by some other advocates. And, I think it really is about building a foundation of, just knowing what you need for your project and have common goals and a purpose for engagement and really make sure that it's a good engagement for both sides coming both ways. And, have an environment of respect is so important. And then compensate if you can. I think it's becoming critical that the more we use and the more patients are engaged in research to compensate them for their time and effort is becoming really important. So I wrote a recent article and I came up with these steps to engagement for the researcher to do. So I think I have sides what the patient advocate should do, but this talk is about researchers and clinicians and what you should do. And really you need to decide why you're going to engage a patient advocate right off the bat. How will you include them? What will they contribute? And what information will be gained? And you really need to do that work up front because it's really important when you get to the step of identifying a patient for your research that you know what type of patient advocate you need and who you need. So do the patients have to have a specific experience? And I think in breast cancer, it's really important if you're doing a study or a project in metastatic breast cancer, it's probably really important for you to reach out and really try to find a patient with metastatic breast cancer to really participate in your study. Sometimes you need a lot of different things, so maybe it's more than one patient advocate. Maybe you need someone who has experience in diversity and disparities, and you want to include that person as well as someone with a patient with metastatic disease, so you might want to do a couple, but you really need to plan ahead and figure out what you want. The hard part here is how will the patient advocate be identified? And I think there are some things coming. I know at Lineberger, we're coming up with a system for that. Organizations, Komen has the Advocates in Science, National Breast Cancer Coalition has advocates. And then once you identify an advocate and reach out, really have that upfront discussion. And when I match researcher to advocate, I always recommend they do a Zoom and talk about the study, figure out who each other is and, where they're going to benefit and how they're going to interact during this whole experience of engagement. And then, really discuss how you're going to communicate. I can't tell you how many times I'm contacted and then I never hear back whether the grant got funded or it might get funded, but I'm not really sure how often we're going to meet. And then time can just go by because, research moves very slow sometimes, and time can go by, but the patient advocate doesn't realize what you're doing. So just have a way to communicate and what those expectations are so everybody has the same idea of what those expectations are. So now I'm going to go over an example in the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology. So this is one of the NCTN cooperative groups, and I've been involved in CLGB since 2008 and then the Alliance since it started, and I now chair the Patient Advocate Committee. And I must say, this is such a good committee. It's all cancers, and we work so well together, and it's been so hard not being able to meet for 2 years because we're all in different cancers, we're all in different parts of the United States, and we don't naturally get together at all usually, so it's been really hard over the years, but this is our committee, which I'm very proud of. So I kind of put together this timeline. I've given this talk to other advocates in the NCTN, but this is my idea of how a trial comes to fruition. So in the Alliance, an idea for a trial comes forward and it's developed in the committee. And so we as patient advocates participate in the committee. I'll show you more detail about what we do in each one. Then once the trial goes through committee and is talked about and gets the okie dokie to go to a concept is written up. By now, we've just seen it in slides. We've not really seen a written concept, and it goes to the Alliance Scientific Review Committee. And we have a patient advocate review every concept that goes through the Alliance Concept Review Committee. Out of there, it goes to the NCI steering committees for review, which it can go back and forth, the bidirectional arrows. But once it's approved, it goes for protocol development back at the Alliance. And we're involved in that as well. So I get a patient advocate on every protocol that's being developed. And then our job's not open at that point. The trial opens, but then it's monitored within the committee. So this is where you look at accrual and see what's going on, if there's any barriers that have come up. And we participate in the committees there. We have an advocate that sits on the Data Safety Monitoring Board that looks at toxicity and futility. And then the trial stops, but we don't stop there either. We actually do public summaries of our studies. And this was started in CLGB by Deb Collier, and I'll show you how we still kind of use the same format. So what do we consider in meetings? So we sit in meetings, so we don't think about the same things as you do as trialists or researchers. We think about different things. So will this make a difference in patient care in a positive way? Will participation be hard for the patient? So is there randomization? It's always hard for patients when there's randomization, and will it be acceptable? Is it complicated? Do we need educational materials? Will the outcome be important to patients? And are there added costs? We really look at this hard to see if things aren't covered by insurance, are they going to be covered by the study? And are there the patient inclusion and exclusion appropriate? I always look at those. And the expanding and the broadening eligibility criteria that came out in 2017 and 2021 should be read by anyone who is setting up a trial. When we review for the Scientific Review Committee, we have a worksheet or a guidance for our advocates. So we give them some cues on what to look for in the concept. So we look at study impact to the patient, feasibility, innovation, NCTN relevance. Does it really need all these sites? Usually it does. Study design and overall impression. And then on the protocol committee, so we're in on the protocol development from draft 0 to draft 4. We used to just come in at draft 4, but when you have the concept of 10 pages that goes to a protocol of 150 pages, it's really nice to gradually ease into that. But we really look at different things. We look at eligibility, we'll look at the PROs that are going to be included. We look at the correlative science sometimes too. We look at the schedule to burden. We look at the consent form. We read it for readability and understandability. And then other protocol concerns specific to different protocols, which might be accrual or equipoise if it's randomized, or what patient population the study is in. We do a lot of studies in the older population, and so we try to get people that are older to look at the study so they know whether it's acceptable to older patients. And then for public summaries, we do this. We've done this since 2008. We did, Deb Collier came up with a template, and we still use that template. We modify it, but we try to do plain, or I call regular language, because we're not plain language specialists. And it's written after the same time of publication. We do it as a team. So we'll write as patients now, but we send it to the study team, the executive officers, protocol coordinators for all the reviews that need to be done. And they're on the Alliance website. So we have quite a few on the website. I think we have greater than 70 on the website right now. And so here's one of our early ones. I think this is our favorite, CALDB 40601, that was done a while ago, and then this is one of our current ones. So it hasn't changed in a lot of time, but we think they're really important, and I presented at one meeting, and somebody actually sent me an email that she actually printed it off and gave it to a patient that actually was taking that drug that we wrote the summary on, so she was very appreciative of that. That's the first time I heard that somebody actually used it, so I was very happy about that. And so that's all I have, so I would take any questions, and these are my contact information. If you want to contact me, I'm available. So.
Thank you so much for the excellent talk. We'll open it up for Q&A. For folks in the room, feel free to come up to the microphone and ask a question. We'll start with the first one. How do you deal with the charge that patient advocates are too well-informed and therefore could be a bit removed from many new patients?
Yeah, so sometimes you think, we have this discussion a lot about staying in the lane of the patient viewpoint and not going in the lane of, the science viewpoint, because the more you learn, right? And you can ask questions, but when I do reviews, we try to stress to really stay in that patient perspective lane. And I can tell you a lot of us that are research patient advocates have a direct connection to patients in our own communities. I facilitated a support group for 12 to 15 years in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I can tell you the people in my support group were very different than the patient advocates that I interact with here. And I bring those stories to the forefront all the time because every patient is different. I also have a mother who had breast cancer who's very different from me, and I bring her perspective to the table as well. So a lot of us don't bring just our own perspective. We try to really reach out to the community and bring that. And we have a lot of patients that live in rural communities as well that bring that access to clinical trials and access to care to the table.
And that's why your point about collective input was really important. Another question, congratulations for your excellent work. Do you have a group of people adapting your work in other languages?
Ooh, in other languages. I think so I don't do any other languages, but I know there are some advocates that do a lot in Spanish, and I know there are a few that do a lot on patient engagement. And actually, some of the conferences, I know like the Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowerment would have a Spanish language arm of the conference at the same time as the English. So I know Barbara Segarra does a lot and Julia does a lot. So I think that's coming along, but I think it's something that we really need to concentrate on that I've never really concentrated on.
And that speaks to the importance of the work. Another question, and this relates to when outcomes might not be important. Could you comment on why in certain circumstances clinical outcomes would not be important for patients?
Yeah, so I think I just saw a tweet today. When you set up your study and you're looking for something, we're asked a lot about, if we have a difference of 5% is that good enough, right? So there was a study, I think, that had a progression-free survival difference of 3 months, right? So is that good enough? Right, so, or are we incrementalizing it? So, especially when you do non-inferiority studies, right? So, how much are you willing, I call it, how much are you willing to lose? And I know people don't like me to say that, but that's what I think. When I say how much am I willing to go down before I keep calling it non-inferior. Is it 3%, is it 5%? And I think we did some question of advocates at TBCRC and other places, and it varies. Some have little, they want it to be identical or very much the same, and then others, it can be within 5 to 8%. Some said 8. I'm like, oh my gosh. But those type of things are kind of things that you really need to think about. So when you come out and you say, it worked and it's significant, but then patients look at it and go, what really did you give me? Another month? I really want my whole life. So I think, couching it in real life situations, I think is really important.
Time for 2 quick questions. The first one, nice talk. What are the typical incentives for patients to participate in trials? Why do they participate and why they don't?
Okay, the best incentive and best way to get a patient on a study is for the physician to ask the patient if they want to be on the study. And I can't stress that enough. It's having the studies available where patients are and then having the physician ask. I think once you get to the point where physicians are asking patients, the uptake is very high. It's when you don't have the physicians ask and it's done a different way, the success rate is just not as high. So I think it's really about not only getting patient buy-in that once they're introduced to the study, they say yes, but also getting the physician comfortable with the study. And I think a lot of physicians are more comfortable with those studies that have looked at patient burden, that have looked at patient outcome, and that they think are really going to benefit their patients, and then they'll really ask more.
Final question, and this is about resources. For metastatic breast cancer, one option is to go to MetaViver. Could you comment on potential resources for patients in terms of how to contact patient advocates?
Resources for patient advocates?
To contact patient advocates.
Huh?
To contact
patient advocates. So it's really hard. There are some listservs out there that I use. Being in North Carolina, we had a great Komen Metastatic Breast Cancer Impact Awards where you needed a lot of patient advocates who had metastatic disease and lived in North Carolina. It was really difficult. But using different listservs of patient advocates, whether it's the PAIR listserv or the Advocate Collaborative, I think GRASP is working on some things, but I think that, those things are coming together. I know at Lineberger, for our Lineberger researchers, we're really working on operationalizing kind of the patient advocates through our Community Outreach and Engagement Corps, through the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement. So we're going to have, where we can have, bring in more patient advocates so that when we do have, researchers looking for a patient advocate, we'll have a pool of advocates to go to and kind of do. And so when we start recruiting to that pool, we have different committees right now, but they're very small. We really want to make sure that we're really diverse and we include, every type of patient. In North Carolina, it's important to get rural patients as well as those with metastatic disease, as well as those with lobular cancer, as well as those with, we'll be working on every cancer. But, I think, once we do things like that. But right now, there's not really one system that really can help you with that, which is really, really hard. So when you know someone, you can reach out. People reach out to me all the time, and then I try to farm out and find people. I don't mind doing that, but it doesn't work if it's just one person. We need a better system.
Thank you so much again. That was an excellent discussion, lots of questions. Thank you again.
Thank you.